Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this members exclusive talk, Conserving and Displaying Fashion at the NGV. My name is Zoe and I'm from the audience engagement team at the NGV, and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. Now, normally if this talk were being presented at the gallery, I would begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kulin people, which we now know as Melbourne. And for me, that's still true as I come to you today from my home. But as we are coming to you remotely today, I would also like to acknowledge that many people present with us today may be on the lands of other traditional custodians, and I would like to pay my respects to those communities wherever they are as well. If you have any questions or comments during the talk today, please use the chat function, which we'll be monitoring throughout. My colleague Felicity will be assisting me today, so you may hear from her in the chat. We will try to get through as many questions as we can, and we will hold them off to the end of the presentation. I will now introduce our speakers for today, Skye, Firth and Ellen Doyle. Skye is Senior Conservator of Textiles at the NGV, and Ellen is a Textile Display Specialist at the NGV. And today they're going to share with us some insights into the process of conserving and displaying fashion at the gallery. So over to you now, Skye and Ellen.
Thanks, Zoe. So my name is Skye, and welcome to our little talk today. So what we would like to do for you today is give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what happens behind the scenes in our textiles lab. We could talk endlessly about what happens in the textiles lab and the amazing collection that we have. And it is very, very wide ranging. But that would be a little bit difficult to do in this sort of platform. So what Ellen and I have done for you today is we've chosen two separate pieces that are some highlights for the last couple of years that we have actually treated within the lab. So these are the two pieces that we'd like to present to you today. So the first one on the right of the screen is a robe de la Polonaise, and the date on this robe is, this dress is about 1780. We like to call her Little Miss Peppermint. The other dress on the left of the screen is a Calais afternoon dress from about 1900. The robe de la Polonaise entered our collection in 2018, and the Calais dress entered our collection in 2015 as part of the Christina Campbell Pretty Fashion Gift. And she was actually on display during the exhibition, if any of you did actually see it. So I want to have a little pause here and just acknowledge that while we're presenting you just a little sneak peek today, and we're the ones talking about it, a lot of the decision making happens in conjunction with many other people. So it's not just us making the decisions. So a lot of the decisions happen in conjunction with our curator and also everyone else in the textiles lab as well. And it is really a lot of discussion goes on behind the scenes. We have a lot of historical research that we undertake, as well as analytical research on the fibres and the fabric themselves. And all of these functions happen before we actually start doing any treatment. So the first piece that I wanted to chat to you about was our robe de la Polonaise. So the Polonaise is a robe that came into fashion in about 1770 and 1780s, primarily in France, and we believe that this gown is actually French in origin. And its distinct features, which Alan will talk about a little bit more later, is the upswept back, which gives her the voluminous behind, essentially, when she's on display. And as I said, Alan will speak a little bit more about that. Look, when Little Miss Peppermint, as you see her here, when she first came into the lab, and that's the photo on your left, she's looking a little bit sad, it was really clear to us that she had actually been messed with later in her life. We suspect, given the way that she had been altered, so to speak, is that she was probably used after her initial use as a dress that somebody would have worn, probably in the French courts. We suspect that she was actually used either for fancy dress, or she was actually used later perhaps for a theatre costume. And the reason we think this is the bottom pleating that you see right in the centre of the screen here was really messed with. It had been painted over with a silk paint, which was that slightly darker peppermint colour that you see on the right of that image in the centre. It had been really slapped on quite roughly. It hadn't been done through the whole piece, and it was clear that part of the pleating had been also taken off. A lot of the original stitching was lost, and also there was this really strange white substance also on a lot of the pleating, not over the whole lot, but only on some. It looked a bit like someone had tried to rub talc into the fabric. And what we think is that the reason that we think it was potentially either a theatre costume or a fancy dress piece is that someone was obviously trying to get a specific look to that. Didn't like how it was originally, so messed with it a little bit. So the decision was made for us in conjunction, as I said before, in conjunction with our curators. The decision was made to take this lower pleating piece off. Apart from anything else, a lot of the stitching wasn't original anymore. There was some really chunky bright blue thread that was securing onto the piece. So what I did was I removed the pleat, and you can see on the image on the right, there's some bright red thread that I've used. Now, what I did is I've actually used that thread right throughout the whole section of pleating to mark where original stitches was. As I said, a lot of the original stitching was lost, but there was some. So I was very careful to make sure that we had some indicating points where that original stitching was. So then from there, we knew that we needed to do something with the pleating that had been messed around with a little bit. So the decision was made to actually wash this piece of pleating. So I'll bring you to the other slide. That's the piece of pleating which shows you actually quite how long it is, actually wetting out in the initial phases of being washed. There was some really strange reactions coming off it. We were very careful when we were washing it to keep in mind the pH of the fabric, so we knew that the fabric itself underlying wouldn't actually be in any danger. But the water turned very cloudy, which was a really strange reaction for something like this. We did manage to get rid of most of the strange ingrained white substance. We did get a little bit of a reaction from the really pepperminty coloured dye that they had put on. Not a huge amount, but it does look better now. And then what happened is obviously it needed to be put back onto the dress. So we were very careful to recreate the pleats where we had original fold lines, and surprisingly a lot of those original fold lines were there. And then what I did was I sewed it back on using the original stitching lines into the original skirt, which is really time consuming. 18th century fabrics are in amazing condition, but one of the things about them is they're very, very tightly woven. So it actually took a significant amount of time for me to get the needle actually through the fabric, but it works beautiful in the end, and she looks amazing. So now I want to throw over to my colleague Alan, who is going to talk about underpinnings.
Thanks, Skye. So as Skye mentioned, we work with the curatorial team and also with conservation. So displaying textile artworks, especially historical garments, requires really careful consideration and handling. And this is often due to the fragility of the materials, but also the three-dimensional nature of the costume. So they have a certain amount of weight. So the display needs to be conservation safe, which means that when I'm building underpinnings, they need to be able to support the dress and bear the weight of the garment over the full period of display. And for curatorial and historical design features of the dress also need to be considered and shown to their best ability. So my process usually is, there's sort of three aspects and they're not usually linear. I kind of jump between different things. So initially analysis and research. So first-hand sources are very useful, and usually the garment itself gives me really a lot of indication of how it wants to sit and what needs to go underneath it. Sometimes we're lucky enough to have sketches or other garments that we can look at. And then there's contemporary sources such as fashion plates and paintings and photographs. And then secondary sources like other exhibitions online, other collections online, and historical pattern drafting books. Then we move into the design and experimentation stage. So usually a garment is built on top of the understructure. So when I'm working with a garment, I'm working backwards essentially. I've got the garment and then I have to work out what went underneath it. So a lot of taking measurements and examining the cut of the garment gives me a lot of clues about what is going on there. And as historical garments were usually made to fit someone specifically and usually very like a glove, there is a bit of experimentation required to get that completely right. And then the final stage is creating a pattern, draft and sewing and putting to actually physically building the underpinning. And it's important in this stage to make sure the materials are conservation safe. So nothing sharp, nothing containing metal, nothing corrosive or abrasive. So therefore they look really austere and nothing like the glamorous garments that they support, but they do the job. They're the workhorse. So firstly, we're looking at this polonaise, which Skye's introduced. So the style at this time of the later part of the 18th century, we start to see the skirt becoming more rounded rather than the more square sort of shape that we saw earlier. And we have that closed bodice robe with a lot of volume at the back. And in this particular style, the skirts at the back of the bodice have been tied up with little loops and ties at the back just to give all that fullness over the back of the skirt. So to begin with, I chose a KCI 18th century mannequin. We have a suite of these great historical mannequins at the NGV. They're pretty good, these mannequins. One thing about them though is that they don't have any waist, which that whole section is hollow, which is great because it means we can determine what waist size, but it also means that it's a little bit unstable. So I've made a replica corset from that era, which is a very conical shaped and very low, well, almost below the bust style corset. And then from there, to achieve the skirt silhouette, I've made this tube petticoat that you can see, and that basically functions to hold the dress away from the mannequin. So it acts pretty much like what your hips and legs would be like in a dress. And to achieve the rounder skirt, you can see these pocket hoops. So pocket hoops became fashionable in the later part of the 18th century as a departure from the larger, more formal kind of pannier. And they're basically, they're kind of pretty much like a pocket, but they're boned. So they're supported with plastic boning in there to hold them out. And then you can also see on the back there's a little bum pad to help get that fullness through the back as well. So the replicas are made from calico and pretty much plastic boning, and traditionally they would have been made from beautiful hand-woven linen and baleen or cane. So then moving on to the next layer, we have trying to keep getting a good fullness in that skirt. And I experimented with this one using a piece of felted, industrial felted fabric that we had, because I really wanted to get the feeling of multiple petticoats and the softness that I had observed in lots of paintings from this time. And the fabric itself, although it's quite dense, it's really quite light and soft. And so I wanted to achieve that look without just adding lots of petticoats, because there's not the time or resources for that. So that's why we've got this felt one. And then over the top of that, there's the final petticoat, which is made from calico. And I've put a bit of a ruffle on the bottom there, and that's to support that ruffled piece on the actual garment that Skye spent so long getting to look beautiful. you want to move on to the,
Yep,
no, here we go. There's more. So there we go. That's her all dressed up, and you can see how we've scooped up her skirt and tied it up at the back. And there's an interesting little detail on the skirt there. You can see on the hip there's a decorative little slit. So that is actually, during this time, garments didn't have pockets. Pockets were worn as a completely separate garment, and they can be quite beautiful and ornate. So they would tie around the waist the pockets, and they would sit over the hoop. And in this case, they would sit inside those hooped structures, and the woman could just sort of slip her hand into that slitted section on the skirt and get into her pocket and get out her handkerchief. Or
they're very cool.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Ellen. So now we move to our other lady. So our beautiful Conservator dress, one of the things that we did note about her when we were first trying her on is that she's really, really teeny tiny. She's one of the smallest pieces that we had of the 19th century pieces actually in the Christina Campbell Pretty Fashion Show. But in terms of condition, the actual silk that creates most of the dress is actually in really great condition, and we've got a couple of slides later. The way that it's been sewn together is phenomenal. It's absolutely the most perfect sewing you've ever seen in your life, because all of the stripes are on a diagonal, and so it's just beautiful. But one of the big issues with the dress is that the very top of the bodice, which is this beautiful chenille lace that you see on the left, actually had a huge issue underneath. So it's actually an outer layer of lace that's been decorated with silk, velvet and chenille, but underneath that is a complete, essentially a copy of that lace layer of a really creamy crepe layer of silk. So what had happened is that crepe layer had basically disintegrated due to use and due to areas of stress. So it had disintegrated around the neckline, under the arms, and also the elbows. So what I had to do for that is essentially recreate a new silk layer for it. Funnily enough, I was blessed with this piece to actually be able to follow the original sewing line. So what I was able to do was create a new sleeve, so a single piece of silk for each sleeve, a single piece of silk for the front of the bodice, and a single piece of silk for the back of the bodice. And then I got to hours and hours of couching the damaged silk back to that new silk that I've got. So you can see that upper picture, which has those strange little lines on it. That's actually my couching stitches that I spent many an hour in the lab stitching that to actually support it, not only during display, but also once she's back in storage, and also adding to the longevity of the item. The other thing, obviously, because lace is very fragile, the other thing that I did have to do a little bit for this piece is actually help a lot of holes in the lace. So there were a lot of holes throughout the skirt layer. There weren't so many throughout the bodice, some here and there. So the bottom picture is actually a preliminary shot of me relining up areas of lace to actually do some stitching on for the piece. And the other thing that we did have to do with this gown too is you can see on that the very top of that image on the left, the beautiful silk flowers are a little bit dirty, so we did have to do some spot washing using some blotting paper, which is a way we can actually spot wash pieces without getting the whole piece wet. It allows us to be very specific in what we actually clean, and so that was really successful. It allowed a lot of the dirt to come out of the piece, but also a lot of the crushed velvet, and as you would know, a lot of you who ever want anything that's velvet, it crushes very easily. So, but in order for me to do that treatment, one of the benefits was a lot of that fibre of the velvet actually stood back up again during the drying process. So that was really good. But again, I'll throw over to Alan to talk about her underpinnings.
Thanks, Skye. So the fabric combination on this dress is really quite fabulous and very reflective of this era, of the Edwardian era, where there was a lot of use of lace. Lace was extremely popular and heavy ornamentation, but great novelty in the ornamentation. So lots of very experimental, different, uses of beading. And in this case, the use of the chenille and the velvet, it makes it a very unique garment. So this is a bodice and a skirt, early 20th century. So the silhouette from this period is that of very full in the hips with the mono bosom thrust forward and a spinal curvature. It's a very unusual shape if you've never seen it before, and a very small waist, and in particular in the case of this,
very tiny.
Very tiny. So little secret with this one, she actually didn't quite fit on the mannequin, and she had a very complicated closure system that went over her shoulder. So we were able to slot in a little bit of fake fabric there for display to hide the fact that she didn't quite fit into her dress.
Yeah.
Be great if we could all do that, really. But
wouldn't it?
So again, the silhouette was created using a corset, a replica corset that I made for this one. It's on a KCI early 20th century mannequin, which gives that mono bosom shape. The corset that I made, I copied from a pattern, an original pattern from this era, and I didn't heavily bone it as much as the original, because there's not a real body in there, so that's not essential. And again, it's got the plastic boning and the calico, so very boring to look at, and tube, and there's a tube support petticoat here again, just to hold the dress away from the mannequin so it just doesn't drop in. And then on the next slide, I think, Skye, we've got the petticoat. So yeah, the petticoat for this one, we actually made out of the decision was made to make it out of a silk, so it's like a very light habité silk, and we made it in a colour that would just blend in with the rest of the dress, because the bottom section of the dress is completely sheer, but we didn't want to have, you don't want to be distracting with the underpinning. We just wanted it to just highlight the dress. So and you can just see that I've sort of copied basically the shape of the dress, the shape of the skirt when I've made the petticoat. Petticoats, oh yeah, and the fabric for this is really light too, because it didn't require a heavy petticoat to hold the skirt out. And petticoats at this time, during the Edwardian time, could be very elaborate, and they were made from fine cotton and silk and taffeta and all manner of trimmings, lace and ruffles. And I do like to imagine what the original petticoat would have been like for this dress, because it is sheer at the bottom. I feel like the petticoat was probably a little bit of a feature for this dress. And that's Skye and I dressing her there for her final display. Yeah.
But look, there's some really great up close photos of that beautiful silk fabric, and also the amazing lace as well. So, and it just shows you, as Ellen was saying before, that unusual sway of the back and the teeny tiny waist. But yeah, it's absolutely beautiful piece. So it's been one of the highlights for us. So yeah, and there's a little final slide there of both of our girls ready and done up for display. So the Robe de la Polonaise on the right, and then the Calais Sir on the left. So I think that's it for us for the moment. So I might throw back to Zoe and hope that we might have some questions from you guys.
Hi, Skye and Ellen. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It's one of those things, it must be so familiar to you, but for me, just knowing the amount of work that goes into these and all the knowledge that you must have when we get a new piece like this to know even where to begin. It's really fascinating. So thank you so much. And
Thank you.
great to see so many of those beautiful images showing the details up close as well.
Yeah, look, it's really nice to see, and now that there's a little bit of time has passed between the us actually doing the treatment, it's sort of nice to reminisce a little bit on these pieces and see them again. Yeah.
And actually that brings me to my first question is, how long does a treatment like this usually take, or is there, does it really vary, or is it always about the same amount of time?
Look, it really varies depending on what's needed. So in terms of treatment time for the Doyle Polonaise, it probably took, from my portion of the treatment, so taking the ruffle off and then doing the treatment on that and then popping it back on, it probably took about a month to actually do that. And then, Ellen, it probably took you probably at least a month to actually do the underpinnings, yes?
Yeah, by the time you do, all the research and experimenting and it would take a month, I'd say, putting it all together.
Yeah. And look, the callow was probably a little bit quicker for me, probably sort of maybe 3 weeks to do that. But a lot of it is, in some ways, it's sort of hard to gauge because a lot of the treatments that we do, we're not just concentrating on one at a time because we've got several things that need to happen in order to meet deadlines. So often we're treating multiple things at the same time.
Mm.
So definitely.
Yeah, same for me. That one was.
We have had a couple of questions come through.
Sure.
So first question is, it was a specific one of the silks you mentioned. It sounded like habitat silk. Is that correct?
Habitai. Yeah, it's just a very lightweight silk. Yeah.
Thank you. And where are they stored?
They're stored in our storage facility. So the Doyle Polonaise is actually stored in a wardrobe. She's actually hanging up in a wardrobe. It's a really robust piece, so she's actually able to hang. She has a storage form that she hangs on, which is made out of obviously acid-free materials. The callow piece actually is stored within a box because the lace is so fragile. We're unable to actually hang her. So she actually lives in a box in our storage facility as well, and in an acid-free storage box that are specifically designed for us. So yes, they're both well stored.
It's interesting you mentioned that one is more fragile than the other. With the one that's more fragile, does that mean it probably wouldn't be displayed because it will be too fragile to display, or would it still?
No, not at all. I say fragile as in because it's lace. Inherently, the lace is fragile because in order to hang it into a wardrobe, it will be hung with multiple other things. And the risk with hanging anything that is lace is that it obviously can catch on other pieces within the wardrobe when somebody comes into the wardrobe to get something out. The other risk with actually hanging something that's lace is that lace obviously stretches over time, and we want to basically avoid that as much as possible. So that's why for anything that's lace, which is inherently fragile, we actually store all of our lace pieces actually in boxes rather than hanging them.
Great, thank you. And I'm also curious to know how heavy both of these dresses would be. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to wear one of these.
Well, I think you with a corset, you definitely wouldn't have been able to breathe very well. The calais serge dress is really quite light. There's not a lot to the dress at all. It's probably overall by itself, it's probably maybe only 2 or 3 kilos. Do you think, Ellen?
Yeah, it's not very heavy at all, that dress.
Not very heavy at all.
I think the thing that would have been heaviest about wearing that dress would have been the petticoat, because I imagine it would have been quite a full petticoat and very ornate. So yeah.
The Polonaise is a little bit heavier. There's a real robustness to that fabric. I would imagine that the Doyle Polonaise probably weighs about maybe 6 kilos or something. It's again, it's not really heavy. And yeah, I think it would have been definitely the amount of underpinnings that you would have had to have been wearing underneath.
Yeah. I think often with the 18th century costumes, they're not, well, a lot of the ones in our collection aren't particularly heavy, but it would have been all of the things that you'd worn underneath. So that the big pannier and the multiple petticoats and the corset, and that would have given you the weight. But an interesting thing too about the wearing of a corset is that it gives a silhouette, but the corset also holds a lot of the weight of the skirt. So we think about wearing those skirts in terms of how we dress now, which is just on our bodies, but the corset would have really supported the volume of those skirts as well.
And keep in mind too, a lot of certainly the polonaise would never have been worn by sort of an ordinary person. You know, in order for someone to have afforded that much fabric in a dress in that sort of sense, they would have definitely been a member of the court. So they would have been a wealthy person to begin with, and as such, I dare say they probably didn't do a huge amount of walking around. So I think they did probably a lot of sitting and looking elegant into official gatherings. So that's something else to keep in mind too.
Yeah, really interesting and fascinating to think, yes, about the layers that go into dressing in those times as well. The final question that's come through is actually a more general question to both of you. It's someone wondering if you have any recommendations for pursuing fashion conservation as a career.
Fashion conservation there is a Melbourne-based course that does do conservation. Unfortunately, you cannot, as I am aware at the moment, you cannot specialise in fashion. My advice would be look at some overseas courses. There's an amazing course in the UK, and there are some amazing courses out there in order to specialise in fashion conservation. But at this stage, sadly, not in Australia. So you would have to go overseas in order to do that. But, you know, volunteering in areas and actually, you know, getting to help out other collections is a really good way to get your name out there, and you know, then perhaps actually go and do your qualifications some other time. So yeah, getting your name out there and doing some volunteer work really does help.
Perfect. Thank you so much to both of you. This has been a really wonderful, insightful talk to kind of spend a beautiful, what's now at least for me, a sunny afternoon.
Yeah, I have some sun too finally, which is nice.
So thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today, all of our members. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. We will be sending you all an email survey shortly, so if you have some time, please do share your experience with us. We do always love to hear your feedback. And we hope to see you at another online talk soon. So you can keep an eye on the NGV website or social media to hear what we have coming up. Our next talk is actually happening next Thursday, which will be another online talk looking at the work of Francois Gillot and Dora Maar through a study of 3 new acquisitions to the gallery. So that should be very interesting as well. So thank you again, Skye and Ellen, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Zoe.
Bye.
Thank you.